Okay, when you think tree huggers, do you think A, dirty hippies, B, mom, or C, Richard Nixon? You should think Richard Nixon.
Our land, this land that is ours together, is a great and a good land. It is also an unfinished land. And the challenge of perfecting it is the summons of the 70s. It is in that spirit that I address myself to those great issues facing our nation which are above partisanship.
One of those things that was above partisanship that year, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Richard Nixon established it with support from Congress in 1970. In that State of the Union address, he went on to say, "We can no longer afford to consider air and water common property, free to be abused by anyone without regard to the consequences." And yes, I am unironically and unsnarkily quoting Richard Nixon. One of the things the newly established EPA did in the early 70s is that they commissioned photographers to travel across the country and document some of the consequences of environmental neglect, of why our country needed something like an EPA. These are some of those images. In 1970, there was no Clean Water Act. That's women's holding water from her well. No Clean Air Act. Right? There were virtually no laws regulating how much toxic waste companies could dump into the water. The EPA changed all that after Richard Nixon created it. Richard Nixon, by the way, in case you haven't heard, was a Republican. Today's Republicans blame the EPA for pretty much everything wrong in the country, and that's only half hyperbole. 7 of the 10 jobs agenda ideas put forward by House Republicans this August, ideas meant to create jobs, were things that would kill environmental regulations. 7 of the 10 were to undermine the EPA in some way. Anti-EPA politics are so extreme in Republican politics right now that Kentucky Senator Rand Paul recently argued against power plant pollution rules by actually sort of arguing that power plant emissions might be good for you. Listen.
Now, one of the other things people argue about, and one of the big health concerns they have with pollution, is with regard to asthma. The interesting thing is that if you look at all the statistics on all of the emissions from our power plants, all of these declining lines are emissions. We have decreased pollution and rising incidence of asthma. So either they're inversely proportional or they're not related at all.
Maybe they're inversely proportional. Senator Rand Paul proposing that it's possible that maybe power plant emissions cure asthma. Think of the implications for medicine. Feeling sick? Suck a tailpipe. The Associated Press called out Senator Paul's baffling pseudoscience. A quick side note, it turns out that Senator Paul's biggest donor is the delicious, delicious coal industry. Republican presidential candidates seem to be trying to one-up each other each week in how against the EPA they are. Candidates Michelle Bachmann, Newt Gingrich, and Ron Paul, runs in the family, I guess, are promising to dismantle the EPA altogether. Rick Perry and Herman Cain say they want to overhaul it somehow. And even the ones who are not pledging to immediately abolish the agency or to take it apart piece by piece are hewing to this year's mystery science economics. Broadly speaking, the Republican candidates' line this year is that Wall Street blowing up in 2008 is not why the economy has gone off a cliff. No, they say it's Richard Nixon's EPA that did it. Joining us now for the interview is not Richard Nixon, but rather the administrator of our nation's Environmental Protection Agency, Lisa Jackson. Administrator Jackson, thank you for being here.
That's a great intro. I am not Richard Nixon.
You don't look a thing like him. It seems impossible that the one of the Republican legislative legacies of this century is the EPA, because it seems that environmental protection has become an issue on which there is a stark partisan divide. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I actually do. I think that it is unprecedented, the level of attack that we're seeing, not only on the agency, but on the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act, the fundamental bedrock laws of our country. And I actually learned a new phrase, above partisanship. And I keep saying, I said that when I took office as administrator, the environment has always been nonpartisan, above partisanship. There's no one who doesn't argue that we should have clean air, clean water, a clean and healthy place to live.
The Republican argument, though, is that in trying to ensure clean air, clean water, and a healthy place to live, there has been regulatory overreach, and that the EPA essentially kills jobs by making it impossible for businesses to be profitable. That's
this is a great example of what I'm now calling the fact-free zone inside the Beltway. There is not one credible economic study, and in fact there have been a raft of them in recent days, that has shown that environmental protections hurt job growth. In fact, EPA has been around for 41 years, as you said, and during that time our GDP has grown over 200%. There's something like less than 0.5% of job losses that are attributed to any kind of government regulation. And I want to be clear on this. I'm absolutely of the belief that we should have a smart, efficient government, that we should make sure that our regulations are up to date, that the standards we set reflect the latest technology. All wonderful, good things. But to tell the American people that the way I'm going to get you employed is to just ask your child to suck on a tailpipe, to breathe more pollution, I think is the choice that's being put before Americans, and it's a false choice.
Does it make sense to you that in a crimped environment that we have right now, crimped economic environment where people are really desperate for some way to move forward, that the regulatory environment broadly and environmental regulation itself would become a target? I mean, even as I think you are right that it is essentially operating in a fact-free zone. This is not something where people are citing a lot of studies, and in the case of Rand Paul, the studies that they're citing are sort of branded Disney. But it does also resonate with me, though, that this argument would work politically, that people would think that it is the heavy hand of government that's holding us back.
When people are scared, when they're worried about the economy, attacks on government pick up. And EPA has been the subject of attacks before. There's sort of a pendulum that swings back and forth. And what's really scary now is that pendulum has swung to a pretty extreme place. We've seen over 170 votes in this Congress alone, most of them initiated by the House Republicans, to overturn air and water rules. And we're talking about the kind of votes that will literally gut the Clean Air Act, something most Americans are sitting at home assuming will be there to protect their families. And it's really important to remind folks that we're not talking about the ability to see across the street, which is a nice thing. We're talking about pollution that gets into your lungs, makes you sick. If you have a respiratory ailment, you'll be at the hospital or the doctor. If you're vulnerable, we're talking premature deaths. Just one of our rules, the Mercury rules that the President talked about in his joint session to Congress, is estimated to prevent 17,000 premature deaths a year. So we're not talking about the abstract Clean Air Act and even those pictures. We're talking about public health. We're talking about who pays those costs. Health costs, or do polluters pay to reduce emissions? One of
the areas of regulation and I guess, and lack of regulation that's been a lot of concern to a lot of people this year is fracking, the means by which people release petroleum byproducts from the earth. And it can be a very efficient way of getting at energy sources. But people are also concerned that we do not know what the chemicals are that are injected into the earth in order to do that. Do you think that there should be additional regulation of that? And does EPA have enough room to maneuver in order to protect drinking water supplies in a fracking environment?
So EPA is in the middle of a study. It's going to take us another year and a half to look at the impacts of fracking on groundwater. And I think it's really important to get scientific information to show the American people what we know. EPA has access to more data than is publicly available, and also to have our scientists look and crunch those numbers. In the meantime, we've also said that where there are concerns, if there need to be additional enforcement, we can do that work. Listen, as an environmentalist, I actually think natural gas is important to our country. I do think that it is a potential big change for us. It has immediate benefits from a pollution side. It has immediate benefits from an energy security side. But what we have to be able to say to people is that in the process of getting this natural gas, we're not going to screw up your groundwater or your drinking water or your air. Their air impacts potentially as well. Now, states are stepping up and doing a good job. So I always say, it doesn't have to be EPA that regulates the 10,000 wells that might go in, but there need to be standards, and they need to be transparent. And when it comes to the chemicals in the fracking fluid, I think that's a fair point. People want to know what's being injected into their water.
EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, I know you don't do very many interviews like this. Thank you for being here.
No, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks
for having me.
It's nice to see you.